August 15, 1943. The night air hung thick over Munda Point, New Georgia. Japanese sentries watched from their bunkers. They heard only the jungle, the distant waves, the calls of unseen birds. Tomorrow, they believed, would be like any other day of war. But beneath that jungle canopy, American engineers were already moving. They came in waves. First the surveyors with their transits and measuring chains, then the bulldozers, massive Caterpillar D8s that growled through vegetation like steel predators. Behind them rolled graders, scrapers, and compactors. Equipment that seemed endless. Equipment that seemed impossible. The Japanese had watched similar attempts by their own forces take weeks, sometimes months. Building an airfield required precision. It required time. It required resources that war did not easily provide. The Americans had something else in mind entirely. What happened over the next 72 hours would challenge everything. The Imperial Japanese Army understood about industrial warfare. It would expose a gap not just in military capability, but in the very philosophy of national power. For centuries, Japanese military doctrine had emphasized spirit over material, willpower over abundance, the warrior's soul over the factory's output. That belief system was about to collide with American industrial democracy in its most tangible form. The story begins months earlier. In the strategic planning rooms of the South Pacific Command, Admiral William Halsey studied maps of the Solomon Islands. His finger traced the chain of Japanese airfields that turned these tropical islands into fortresses. Every airstrip extended Japan's defensive perimeter. Every runway meant more bombers could strike Allied positions. More fighters could intercept American advances. The Japanese had spent 2 years fortifying these positions. They had poured concrete, laid steel matting, built revetments and supply depots. Their confidence seemed justified. These islands had become their domain. But Halsey saw something else in those maps. He saw a pattern, a rhythm, a predictable timeline. Japanese construction followed traditional methods. Their engineers worked carefully, methodically. They built to last. Each airfield took 6 to 8 weeks from conception to operation, sometimes longer. The process involved detailed surveys, careful grading, and precise construction. It was engineering as art, as patience, as permanence. American engineers were about to introduce a different philosophy entirely. The concept had been tested before. In North Africa, American Seabees had proven they could build temporary airstrips in days rather than weeks. But those were in desert conditions, flat terrain, minimal vegetation. The Solomon Islands presented an entirely different challenge. Dense jungle, volcanic soil, daily torrential rains that turned earth to mud within minutes. The Japanese believed this environment made rapid construction impossible. Their own engineers had said as much. They were about to learn otherwise. On August 5, 1943, American forces secured Munda Point after weeks of brutal combat. The fighting had been savage, hand-to-hand in some sectors. The Japanese had defended every bunker, every trench, every inch of ground. When they finally withdrew, they expected the Americans to pause, to consolidate, to spend weeks clearing the battlefield and establishing supply lines. Standard military doctrine said armies needed rest after major engagements, needed time to reorganize, to heal. The Americans did not rest. Within hours of securing the perimeter, the 1st Engineering Battalions arrived. They came with charts already prepared, surveys already completed using aerial reconnaissance photographs, every contour line mapped, every obstacle identified. Before a single tree fell, American planners knew exactly where the runway would sit, knew where taxiways would branch, knew where revetments would shield aircraft from enemy bombing runs. The Japanese, watching from their remaining positions, could not understand what they were seeing. First came the clearing teams. Men with chainsaws and axes moved through the jungle in organized lines. Trees that had stood for centuries came down in minutes. Massive hardwoods that would have taken Japanese engineers days to remove were felled, stripped, and hauled away before the sun set. Behind them came more men, always more men. They worked in shifts. When one team tired, another replaced them. The work never stopped. Not for meals, not for darkness. Floodlights blazed through the night. Generators roared. The jungle that had seemed eternal vanished section by section. Behind the clearing, teams came the heavy equipment. The bulldozers arrived in numbers that seemed absurd. A Japanese engineering unit might have 1 or 2 earth-moving machines for an entire airfield project. The Americans brought dozens. They worked in coordinated patterns. One machine would strip topsoil while another pushed fill. A third would grade while a fourth compacted. They moved like parts of a single organism. Behind them came scrapers that could move cubic yards of earth in single passes. Volumes that would have required hundreds of men with hand tools. But it was not just the machines. It was the system. American engineers had broken the entire construction process into specialized tasks. Each team knew exactly what to do. Surveyors marked grades with colored stakes. Bulldozer operators followed those markers with precision. Grading teams worked to tolerances measured in inches across distances of thousands of feet. Behind them came compaction crews with heavy rollers. Then came the Marston matting teams with their interlocking steel planks. Each piece fit together perfectly, each section connected to the next. The runway grew like a living thing, hour by hour, foot by foot. The Japanese sentries sent reports back to their commanders. The reports seemed like hallucinations. "Enemy construction proceeds at impossible speed," one message read. "Machines operate continuously. Personnel appear unlimited. Request clarification on reported timeline." The commanders thought their sentries were exaggerating. Combat stress caused men to see things incorrectly, to misjudge distances and timeframes. Surely, the Americans were not actually building an airfield this quickly. It violated every principle of military engineering, of logistics, of human endurance. But the reports kept coming, each more urgent than the last. By the end of the first day, the main runway had been cleared and rough-graded across its entire 5,000-foot length. Japanese engineers estimated this phase alone should have taken 2 weeks. The Americans had done it in less than 24 hours. Worse, they showed no signs of slowing. Through the night, the floodlit construction continued. The roar of diesel engines never ceased. The grinding of earth-moving equipment became a constant background rhythm, like a heartbeat, like a machine that could not be stopped. The second day brought the precision work. American engineering battalions laid Marston matting with assembly line efficiency. These interlocking steel planks had been specifically designed for rapid runway construction. Each plank measured 10 feet long and 15 inches wide. They weighed 65 pounds, strong enough to support fully loaded bombers, light enough for 2 men to carry and position. The planks connected with simple hooks and slots. No bolts required, no welding needed, just hook and lock. Hook and lock, mile after mile. Teams worked in coordinated lines. One crew would carry planks forward. Another would position them. A third would lock them into place. Behind them came quality control inspectors who checked alignment and stability. The entire runway surface was being covered at a rate of several hundred feet per hour. The Japanese had never seen anything like it. Their own airfield construction used either poured concrete or carefully laid coral. Both methods required days of preparation and curing. Time. The Americans were building a runway that could be used immediately upon completion. But what truly shocked Japanese observers was the support, infrastructure that appeared simultaneously. While the runway teams worked, other units were constructing everything else an operational airfield required. Taxiways appeared. Revetments went up. These aircraft shelters used prefabricated materials that arrived already cut to size, already shaped, already fitted with mounting hardware. American engineers simply assembled them like giant model kits. Supply dumps appeared overnight. Fuel bladders capable of holding thousands of gallons were rolled into position and filled. Ammunition storage bunkers went up. Command posts, radio towers, maintenance facilities. It was not just construction. It was the instantaneous creation of an entire military installation. On the morning of the third day, Japanese reconnaissance aircraft flew over Munda Point. The pilots could not believe their instruments. They circled, they photographed, they flew lower to confirm what they were seeing. Where 3 days earlier there had been jungle, there now stood a fully operational airfield. The runway stretched perfect and straight. Aircraft revetments lined the sides. Support facilities dotted the perimeter. Supply dumps overflowed with equipment. Fuel storage, ammunition, parts, everything an air wing needed to operate. The reconnaissance pilots reported back. Their commanders accused them of navigating to the wrong island, of mistaking an existing Japanese airfield for American construction. The pilots insisted. They had witnessed something impossible. The Americans had built an entire airbase in 72 hours. That afternoon, the first American aircraft landed at Munda. They came in waves, fighters first, Corsairs with their distinctive gull wings, then bombers, B-25 Mitchells, then cargo planes loaded with additional supplies. Each aircraft touched down perfectly on the new runway. The Marston matting held without flexing, without cracking. The runway that had not existed 3 days earlier now hummed with activity. Ground crews swarmed each aircraft, refueling, rearming, preparing for the next mission. Japanese commanders now faced a strategic nightmare. They had calculated their defensive positions based on American airfield construction rates they had observed earlier in the war. Those calculations said the Americans would need at least 6 weeks to establish air operations from Munda. 6 weeks meant time to reinforce, time to prepare defenses, time to establish new supply lines. Instead, American bombers were now hitting Japanese positions from Munda after only 3 days. The entire strategic timeline had collapsed, but the implications went beyond mere tactics. For Japanese soldiers watching this display of industrial power, something fundamental shifted in their understanding. They had been taught that American forces were soft, undisciplined, that American abundance made Americans weak, that Japanese spiritual strength would overcome material disadvantage. The construction of Munda Airfield challenged every aspect of this ideology. These were not soft men. They were not weak. They worked with a discipline that matched any Japanese unit. But it was a different kind of discipline. Not the discipline of enduring hardship. Not the discipline of making do with insufficient supplies. It was the discipline of organized abundance, of industrial coordination, of systems thinking applied to warfare. The symbolic power of the construction equipment became clear to Japanese observers. Those Caterpillar bulldozers represented something more than machines. They embodied a society that could mass-produce such equipment, that could train thousands of operators, that could ship hundreds of these machines across an ocean and maintain them in jungle conditions. Each bulldozer required fuel, parts, maintenance, skilled operators, support infrastructure. The ability to field dozens of such machines simultaneously spoke to an industrial base that Japan simply could not match. The Marston matting told an even more disturbing story. Someone in America had recognized a specific military need, had designed a solution, had engineered it, tested it, then manufactured hundreds of thousands of these steel planks, shipped them across the Pacific, distributed them to engineering units. All of this required coordination across factories, transportation networks, and military commands. It required a society where innovation could move from concept to implementation rapidly, where military needs could be communicated to civilian industry and answered with mass-produced solutions. This was a kind of warfare Japanese military doctrine had not anticipated. Throughout their military history, Japanese forces had emphasized minimizing supply requirements. Soldiers were expected to endure hardship, to make do with little, to compensate for material shortages with superior morale and fighting spirit. This philosophy had worked well in certain contexts. It produced tough soldiers, resilient units, forces that could operate in harsh conditions with minimal support. But against industrial abundance, it proved inadequate. The Americans did not ask their soldiers to endure unnecessary hardship. They provided them with everything needed to work efficiently. Not just bulldozers and steel matting, not just fuel and ammunition, but also hot meals, medical care, rotation schedules that prevented exhaustion, recreational facilities, mail delivery, ice cream. The Americans even brought ice cream to tropical islands. This seemed like madness to Japanese observers, like decadence, like proof of American softness. But it was not weakness. It was strength of a different kind. Well-fed soldiers worked harder. Rested soldiers made fewer mistakes. Soldiers who knew they would receive medical care if wounded fought with less desperation and more calculated efficiency. The entire American military system was designed not to test human endurance, but to maximize human effectiveness, to amplify each soldier's contribution through superior logistics and support. The completion of Munda Airfield in 3 days proved the effectiveness of this approach conclusively. Japanese engineers, when they later examined American construction methods, found themselves facing uncomfortable truths. The Americans had not built faster through superior skill. Japanese engineers were highly trained, highly capable. The difference was not in individual competence. It was in system design. The Americans had created construction processes that allowed average soldiers with moderate training to achieve extraordinary results through coordination and equipment support. This was democracy, applied to warfare. In Japanese military culture, excellence came from elite units, from specially selected men trained to extraordinary levels. The Americans had democratized effectiveness. They had created systems where ordinary citizens could contribute to complex military operations through their specific roles within larger organizations. The bulldozer operator did not need to understand overall strategy. The Marston matting crew did not need degrees in engineering. Each person needed only to perform their specific task competently. The system coordinated individual contributions into collective achievement. The political implications troubled Japanese military theorists deeply. If ordinary Americans could achieve such results through organizational systems and industrial support, what did that say about Japan's aristocratic military culture? About the emphasis on elite warriors? About the philosophy that spiritual superiority could overcome material disadvantage? Munda Airfield suggested that material abundance, properly organized, created its own form of strength, a strength that did not rely on individual heroism or extraordinary sacrifice, a strength that could be sustained indefinitely because it did not ask the impossible from its participants. American soldiers building that airfield worked hard, but they worked in shifts. They had adequate food. They had rest periods. They had medical support if injured. They had clear instructions. They had the right tools for each task. This was not weakness. This was rational organization of human effort. It allowed sustained high performance over days and weeks and months. It was marathon warfare rather than sprinting warfare. Japan's military philosophy had been designed for the sprint, for the decisive battle, for the moment when superior morale and fighting spirit would overcome. But modern industrial warfare was not a sprint. It was an endless marathon where consistency mattered more than peak performance, where sustainable systems defeated unsustainable heroism, where the side that could maintain effort longest would prevail regardless of individual acts of courage. The Marston matting became a symbol of this reality for Japanese forces across the Pacific everywhere. American forces advanced. Airfields appeared with shocking speed. The pattern repeated on island after island. Tarawa, Paleliu, Saipan, Iwo Jima, Okinawa. Each time, Japanese defenders expected to have weeks before facing airstrikes from newly captured territory. Each time, American bombers were flying missions within days. The steel matting appeared wherever American forces needed it. Always the same, always reliable, always installed with the same efficient process. For Japanese soldiers, those steel planks represented something they could not counter. They could fortify positions. They could dig deeper bunkers. They could fight with suicidal determination. But they could not match the industrial and organizational capability that those steel planks represented. Each plank was a small thing, 65 pounds of steel, but together, in their thousands, laid by organized teams with proper equipment and support, they created capabilities that individual heroism could not overcome. The psychological impact of Munda rippled through Japanese forces in the Pacific. Morale, which had been based partly on the belief that Japanese forces could overcome American material advantages through superior spirit, began to crack. If the Americans could build an airfield in 3 days, what else could they do? How could traditional military virtues compete with such capability? The questions had no comfortable answers. American commanders understood the psychological value of rapid construction. Beyond the tactical advantages, these rapid airfield projects demonstrated power in ways that bombing raids could not. A bombing raid proved you had aircraft and bombs. Building an airfield in 72 hours proved you had industrial depth, organizational sophistication, logistical mastery. It proved you could not just attack, but could establish permanent presence anywhere you chose. The airfield was both weapon and statement, both military asset and psychological warfare. The engineering battalions that built Munda and dozens of similar airfields became legendary within American forces. These were not combat troops in the traditional sense. They rarely engaged in direct firefights, but their contribution to victory was immeasurable. Every airfield they built extended American air power. Every runway meant more strikes against Japanese positions, more supply runs, more evacuations of wounded, more reconnaissance missions. The engineers multiplied the effectiveness of every other military unit in theater, and they did it with methods that seemed mundane. No individual act of extraordinary courage, no desperate last stands, just organized groups of men with good equipment following efficient procedures. Day after day, island after island, building the infrastructure of victory, one steel plank at a time. This was industrial democracy made visible, made tangible, made into military force. For historians studying the Pacific War, Munda Airfield represents a turning point in understanding. The outcome of the war was determined not primarily by dramatic battles or individual heroism, though both occurred in abundance. It was determined by industrial capacity and organizational efficiency, by the ability of American society to mobilize resources, train personnel, develop solutions to specific problems, manufacture those solutions at scale, and deploy them effectively across vast distances. This was total war at the industrial level. War not just between armies, but between entire economic systems. Japan had entered the conflict believing that American society was soft, divided, incapable of sustained military effort. The construction of Munda Airfield and hundreds of similar projects across the Pacific proved otherwise. American society had capabilities that authoritarian military cultures could not match. The ability to empower ordinary citizens to contribute effectively. The ability to organize complex logistics across global distances. The ability to innovate rapidly and implement solutions at industrial scale. These advantages proved decisive. The bulldozers that cleared Munda's jungle were not just construction equipment. They were symbols of American industrial capacity, of a society that could produce complex machinery in massive quantities, of a workforce trained to operate such equipment competently, of supply chains capable of delivering fuel and parts across an ocean, of maintenance systems that kept machines running in tropical conditions. Each bulldozer represented an entire supporting ecosystem of capability. The Marston matting represented American innovation applied to specific military needs. Someone had identified a problem. Airfield construction took too long using traditional methods. Someone had designed a solution. Interlocking steel planks that could be rapidly deployed. Someone had engineered it, tested it, refined it. Then American industry had manufactured it by the ton, shipped it, distributed it. This cycle of identifying needs, creating solutions, and implementing them at scale happened thousands of times during the war. It represented a kind of collective intelligence that military hierarchies often struggled to match. The 72 hours at Munda, compressed into visible form what was happening across the entire Pacific theater. American industrial democracy was not just out-producing its opponents. It was out-innovating them, out-organizing them, out-coordinating them. The speed of that airfield construction reflected the speed of American society's ability to identify problems and implement solutions. This was not because Americans were individually superior. It was because democratic, industrial society had created systems that leveraged individual contributions into collective capabilities. Japanese soldiers watching that construction could not help but compare it to their own situation. They fought with courage, with determination, with willingness to sacrifice. But they fought with insufficient supplies, with equipment that could not be replaced, with rations that left them hungry, with medical care that was primitive. They were expected to compensate for these shortages through superior morale, through spiritual strength, through acceptance of hardship, and many did. Many fought brilliantly under impossible conditions, but courage could not build an airfield in 3 days. No amount of spiritual strength could conjure bulldozers from air. No degree of acceptance could substitute for adequate food, medical care, and equipment. The Japanese military's philosophy asked men to be more than human. The American military's philosophy gave men the tools to achieve superhuman results without requiring superhuman sacrifice. Both approaches produced brave soldiers, but only one could sustain the grinding marathon of industrial warfare. The final symbolic power of Munda Airfield came in its first mission. On August 18, 1943, just 3 days after construction began, American bombers launched from Munda to strike Japanese positions further up the Solomon chain. The Japanese defenders at those positions may not have known about Munda specifically, but they knew American aircraft were attacking from closer range than had been possible the previous week. They knew the American advance continued. They knew their own defensive perimeter was shrinking. The bombers that flew from Munda carried not just explosives, but evidence of American capability. Evidence that could be seen but not countered. Evidence that the war was not just between soldiers, but between entire civilizations' organizational philosophies. Between Japan's hierarchical, spiritually focused military culture and America's democratic, industrially enabled approach to warfare. Between asking men to transcend human limitations through willpower versus giving men tools that made human limitations irrelevant. As the war progressed, this pattern repeated endlessly. American construction battalions island-hopped across the Pacific, leaving airfields in their wake. Each one built faster than Japanese defenders thought possible. Each one extending American air power further. Each one another steel plank reminder that this war would not be won by individual heroism or spiritual superiority, but by industrial depth and organizational sophistication. For the Japanese soldiers who survived to see the war's end, Munda Airfield remained a defining memory. Not because of what happened there militarily. No major battle, no dramatic moment. Just 3 days of construction. 3 days that revealed a truth more powerful than any battle could. That revealed the fundamental mismatch between Japan's military philosophy and the industrial reality of modern warfare. That revealed how democratic societies, by empowering and equipping their ordinary citizens rather than demanding superhuman sacrifice from them, could achieve extraordinary collective results. The steel matting lay there for years after the war ended, slowly rusting in tropical humidity, being reclaimed gradually by the jungle it had temporarily displaced. But its symbolic power remained. Those thousands of interlocking planks, each individually modest, collectively transformative, represented the victory of organized abundance over heroic scarcity, of sustainable systems over unsustainable sacrifice, of industrial democracy over martial aristocracy. August 15th, 1943. 3 days that built an airfield. 3 days that demonstrated a principle. That modern war rewards not those who can endure the most hardship, but those who can organize resources most effectively. Not those who demand superhuman effort from their people, but those who give their people superhuman tools. Not those with the greatest spiritual strength, but those with the deepest industrial reserves and the organizational sophistication to deploy them decisively. The jungle has reclaimed Munda Point now. The steel planks are gone or buried. The bulldozers have long since rusted into scrap. But the lesson remains, written in the history books, studied in staff colleges, remembered by the survivors, that in the calculus of industrial warfare, democracy armed with abundance defeats aristocracy armed with sacrifice. Every time, without exception. Inevitably. 3 days to build an airfield. A lifetime to understand what those 3 days revealed about power, organization, and the nature of modern conflict. The Americans built more than a runway at Munda. They built a demonstration, a proof, a monument to the proposition that free people, properly organized and equipped, can achieve what authoritarian systems demand but cannot deliver, can transform jungle into airfield, can project power across oceans, can win wars not through superior sacrifice but through superior systems. The roar of those bulldozers still echoes through history, still speaks truth to those who listen, still testifies that the strength of democratic nations lies not in asking citizens to transcend human limits, but in building systems that make human limits irrelevant. That abundance, properly organized, is its own form of invincibility. That steel matting and diesel engines, wielded by free people working together, can accomplish what no amount of warrior spirit can match. 3 days, 72 hours, the time it took American engineers to prove that modern war belongs to those who can turn industrial capacity into military capability faster than enemies can respond. Munda Airfield stands in memory as testament to that truth, as warning, as promise that nations which empower their citizens rather than sacrifice them, which organize abundance rather than glorify scarcity, which build systems rather than demand heroes, will prevail in the grinding mathematics of industrial conflict. Every time, inevitably, with the certainty of steel planks locking into place, with the finality of bombers taking flight, with the permanence of victory earned not through sacrifice alone, but through superior organization of national resources in service of rational strategic goals. The Japanese couldn't believe Americans built a fully functioning airfield in 3 days. But belief was not required. Only evidence mattered. And the evidence thundered down that runway every day thereafter until the war ended. Thundered its message. Thundered its truth. That this war, like all industrial wars, would be won by the side that could organize free people and abundant resources most effectively. And on that measure, in those 3 days, at that remote jungle airfield, the outcome became visible to those with eyes to see it, became undeniable, became destiny made manifest in steel and earth and American efficiency.